Now we're going to get into a few bishop versus knight endgames. This one was played in an action tournament in the Marshall Chess Club in New York, 1996. My opponent is one of the great landmarks in American chess. Jay Bonin is an international master who seems to play in every single chess tournament in New York City. He's probably the most active tournament player in America, sometimes even playing 2 or 3 tournaments simultaneously. And he's always a tough guy to meet. Jay's an excellent tactician with a wonderful intuitive feeling for certain types of positions. He's a good technical endgame player, but sometimes he's a little impatient. Jay and I have played countless tournament games over the years, and they're always exciting. Take a look at this position first of all. Before I say anything, what do you think of it? Well, I'm sure you've noticed some differences. First of all, I, as white, have a bishop. He has a knight. I have an outside passed pawn on a4. His passed pawn on c6 is a little closer to the action. One of the key advantages of a bishop over a knight in the endgame is that if the play is on both sides of the board, the bishop can cover distances much more easily and quickly. On the other hand, a knight can cover both dark and light squares. A bishop, this one for example, can only cover light squares. That understood. What is my best move? In a number of the earlier endgames in this course, my first move was a structural decision. Here once again I tie his pawns down to light squares. My first move is f4, a very important decision. Now his f5, g6, and h7 pawns will always be weaknesses. If he had gotten in f4, and then say somehow g5 and h6, now my bishop would have been limited by my own pawns, and his pawns wouldn't have been vulnerable. I played f4. He played knight a5. He has to maintain control of the a5 square, but he shouldn't give up his king's position. My bishop can't drive the king out of c5, and if he goes back, then I can get into d4 or b4. Knight a5 is a good move. But here I missed a key idea. I should have immediately gotten aggressive. I had the idea of bishop b3, aiming for his weaknesses. If he plays knight takes b3, then after king takes b3, the fact that I have an outside passed pawn should be very good for the win. Eventually, his king will have to come to the outside. And when he takes my outside pawn and I take his c6 pawn, it seems that I'm a little closer to the king side than him. This is one of the advantages of having an outside passed pawn. I should be ahead in the race east. I didn't come to such a specific conclusion. I saw he wanted to play knight c4, so I stopped it with bishop d3. I maintained the tension. My bishop versus knight is an advantage. I left it how it was. He played knight back to b7, and now I began my kingside play, h3. Another plan for me would have been again to play bishop back to b1 all the way, followed by bishop a2 and bishop g8. If I play bishop b1, he plays knight a5, for example. Then after bishop a2, if he goes back, then I have bishop g8. And if he plays h6, then bishop h7. He can't defend all of his pawns. If g5 moves, I take the f5 pawn. This would have been a very good plan, but frankly I didn't see it. I was focused on creating a second weakness. A key theme we're going to be looking into in this example and the following ones is the principle of 2 weaknesses. A lot of the time, the defender can successfully handle one weakness, but if you create something else on the opposite side of the board that he has to deal with, his defense can't hold up. I played h3. His first weakness is my a4 pawn. His second weakness, potentially, will be my passed f pawn, after, for instance, g4, the trade, and f5. 2 passed pawns to deal with instead of 1. He played knight a5. Obviously, he's just playing for a draw, repeating moves, keeping control of the a5 square. I played g4, f takes g4, h takes g4, king d5. Now, you might have thought that he could play for the outside passed pawn himself, h5. This would be a mistake. What do you do for white now? While it's true if I play g takes h5, g takes h5, he'll have gained an outside passed pawn, and my f pawn is pretty close to his king. If you recall the idea of the square, even if I play f5, he's still within the square of the pawn. This would be a mistake for me. The correct solution would be the tactical move, f5. Very strong. And now he has big problems. Because if he plays g takes f5, then after g takes h5, I'm the one with the outside passed pawn, and he can't handle that one. If he plays h takes g4, then after f takes g6, my pawn is almost queened, and I win. So h5 would be a mistake for him. He played king d5, and I immediately took advantage of the square being lost. King b4, knight b7, a5. And here my opponent made a critical mistake. Now you'll notice the relationship between my pawn and his knight. If I succeed in playing a6, he won't be able to stop the pawn. If you take away all the pieces, for example, and look on an empty board, if I play a6, there's no way for his knight to cover the a8 square in time. He realized that, and he made the logical decision to sacrifice knight for pawn and then play in the center for his own passed pawns. He played knight takes a5. Remember this position. We'll come back to it. After knight takes a5, king takes a5. My king is temporarily out of the game. Now notice he's the one with the central king, but I'm up a piece. He played h5. How would you play with white? I created a wall against his king. I played g takes h5, g takes h5, bishop f5. A very important idea. In this type of position, when you're defending against a passed pawn with a bishop, and also defending one of your own pawns, the key is to make it all happen on one diagonal. This is the essence of the position. Bishop f5 creates a wall against his king, but also it prepares the moves bishop h3, king e4, f5. If his king goes after my bishop, then he can no longer defend the queening pawn, f6, f7, f8. If his king remains on e5, then I'll simply take his c-pawn with my king, bring my king over, take his h-pawn, and win the game. After bishop f5, he has big problems. He played king d4, and I played bishop h3. Now he saw, of course, that after king e4, f5, he's all roped in, nothing he can do. He decided to push the other pawn, c5, but I had calculated this out. f5. Now again, if he returns with king e5, then king b5 will win the game easily. He played c4, f6, c3, and now bishop f5, defending the c2 square. If his pawn had been on h4, things could have been more interesting. He would have h3, and my bishop is overloaded. If I take the h3 pawn, he plays c2 and c1, and if I just queen, he makes a queen. The position will be tough to win. But he was one tempo behind. After bishop f5, he played king e5, f7, king takes f5, f8, queen check. And we already know from our study of queen against pawn endgames that this is winning. He played king g4. I just played queen g7 check. King h3, queen takes c3 check, and he resigned. If his pawn had been on h2 and his king on g1, this would have been a draw, but his pawn is way too far back, and I win easily. So do you notice how important just one tempo was in this endgame? How in these complicated variations, my win completely depended upon the perfect timing. Is there any moment in his defense when black could have gained a tempo? Details are very important. Let's go back. When I played the move a5, he immediately played knight takes a5. Do you see a way for black to gain a tempo? He should have seized the moment and played c5 check first. This might seem like a very small detail, but it could have changed the outcome of the game. I play king b5, and now he takes it. Knight takes a5, king takes a5, and he plays c4. He's moving much faster. I would go back, bishop b1, and now he plays h5. The difference in this position is his pawn is 2 ranks further up the board. He gained the tempo on my king, and then the tempo on my bishop. After bishop b1, he would play h5. Now I would try g5. He plays h4. He has 2 pawns for me to worry about. I play bishop takes g6. He plays h3. This can get dangerous. I have to stop him from queening. I play bishop h5. Now notice that I'm threatening to queen with check. If he were to play, for instance, c3, then after g6, c2, g7, c1, g8 queen, this is very good for me. Queen and bishop and pawn against queen and king and pawn will be winning. My pawn will prove decisive. Notice, of course, after c3, g6, if he attempts to run back now, king e6, then after g7, my bishop controls the f7 square, and I win. So he can't push the c-pawn, and he also can't push the h-pawn, because then I'll have bishop f3 check, followed by king b4. I stop both pawns, and my pawns will queen. His key move is king e4, which stops the bishop f3 move, and gains a key tempo because I'm no longer queening with check on the g8 square. After king e4, I would play bishop e8. He would play h2. I play g6. And here his critical move is king f5. He's threatening to queen now. If bishop c6, my pawn hangs. I have to play g7. He queens, and I queen. But now the difference is that I'll lose my f4 pawn. He can play king takes f4. And I can choose to play queen takes c4 check, or I can leave that pawn on the board and try to attack him. This position should be a draw. Queen and bishop against queen is too hard to win. So with best defense, if he just noticed all the details of the position, he could have drawn. I want to add one last thing. At one point in this endgame, we reached a point where I had bishop and pawn against king. This is almost always winning. In this game, it was an f-pawn. This position is easily winning because, as we've learned the opposition, the bishop can be used, if for nothing else, just to lose a tempo. If he plays king f7, I play king e5. His king goes back to e7. I play f6. His king goes back to f8, king e6, king e8. Now, of course, I can check him if I want. We know that this would be a draw without the bishop, because after f7, king f8, king f6 is stalemate. But with the bishop, I can play f7, f8, and then I can use the bishop to waste a move. Bishop c2. The king has to move away, king g7, king e7. So that if for nothing else, the bishop can be used simply to lose the tempo. A perfect example in which this could be used would be unlikely in practical play, but take a look at it. This position in which the bishops are completely useless, if it were white's move, would be winning, only because white has the option of moving the bishop. The king and pawn endgame is winning. King f4, king f6. I don't have the opposition, but after king g4, king g6, if we return, I can move my bishop, bishop b2, and I force my way to the critical squares after king h6, king f5, and now we know it's winning. And the bishop can be used again and again if it needs to, just to gain the tempo. The bishop is useless but to lose time. But this isn't always the case. There's one critical endgame you need to know. With a rook pawn, the bishop that does not control the queening square is drawing if the defending king can reach the queening square. In other words, in this position, it's a draw. If the black king can get to h8, there's no way for white to win. It wouldn't matter how many bishops white had on light squares. Even this position would be a draw. Black just moves back and forth, back and forth. There's no way to stop it without stalemating. White's king will eventually come up. The king moves back and forth. If the g8 square is guarded by the bishop, then it's stalemate. It doesn't matter how many bishops are on the board. It's a draw. Now, of course, if white were to have a dark square bishop, this would be completely winning, and very easily. The bishop controls this diagonal. The king comes into the game. After king g8, king g6, the king has to move away to f8, and white simply plays h5, h6, h7, makes a queen. On the opposite side of the board, of course, with an a-pawn, a light square bishop is winning because it guards the queening square, and a dark square bishop is drawing because it doesn't, as long as the king is in the corner. This is a very important exception to know. The bishop has to guard the queening square on rook pawns in order for it to be winning endgame. Now that we've seen an endgame in which a bishop beat a knight, we'll take a look at a game where I had a knight against a bishop. I was up a pawn, and I had to convert the advantage. It's very difficult to beat a bishop with a knight. This endgame was played against a very great friend of mine named Paul Saint-Amand. He's one of the most fantastic characters in the chess world. A great chess player, philosopher, comedian, writer, basketball player. Paul's a Renaissance man. And in truth, you won't meet somebody who's more similar to Seinfeld's Kramer. A great character. We reached this position. I had the black pieces, and it was my move. Now immediately you'll notice I'm up a pawn, but my pawns are doubled. I have a kingside majority, but the f-pawns are 2-1. This isn't so easy to convert. But you'll also notice that his queenside pawns are locked onto the same color square as his bishop. The a3 and b2 pawns are on dark squares. His bishop is on c5, and my pawn chain on c6, b5, and a4 keeps them there. And my knight on d5 is very well placed. And so you see that in the beginning, he doesn't have a great bishop. I have a good knight, and my pawns lock his pawns onto imperfect squares. Now it's black's move. What would you do? Remember, in a lot of the examples in this endgame course, the first move is a key structural decision. When a bishop is on the board, you always want to think about where the pawns belong. If it's your bishop, you want your pawns on the opposite color and your opponent's pawns on the same color as your bishop. When your opponent has the bishop, you want the pawns on the same color as his bishop. On the queen side, we've taken care of that. What about the king side? My first move kept his pawn locked on the g3 square. I played h5. Now this isn't immediately telling, because of course I can't attack his kingside pawns quite yet, but it's very important to take care of the details early. If he had gotten in, for instance, g4, maybe it would have been good, maybe bad, but it would have changed the dynamic. Also keep in mind that bishops have an advantage over knights on an open board, and knights prefer a closed game. h5 keeps the game closed and keeps the pawns locked on the color of his bishop, thus limiting his mobility. It's an important strategical decision. He played king e2. A good decision. Now, of course, I brought my king into the game, like always, king f7. And now Paul played the move b3, trying to break through my queenside pawn structure. Now, this is important for a number of reasons. First of all, one of his ideas is that if after b takes a4, I play b takes a4, he'll have a target to go after with his king. If his king comes, for example, up to king d3 to c4, then he can think about the b4 square if my knight moves. If his bishop moves, he has a c5 square. He can try to attack my weaknesses. Of course, if I ever lose my a4 pawn, I'll have a big problem. That outside passed pawn will be very hard to deal with. So he's trying to create some weaknesses, generate some counterplay. A big part of defeating a bishop with a knight is limiting your opponent's mobility. I want to keep his weaknesses where they are, and I don't want to allow him to have any weaknesses to hone in on. b3 is a good move. He's trying to stir up trouble. What would you do? One of the most interesting lessons that I learned from studying the endgame with Victor Korchnoi for a week was what to do with pawn weaknesses. Victor said an incredible thing to me, and he's one of the great endgame players in the world. He said weaknesses must be pushed. He believed that when you have pawn weaknesses, you should push them up the board, make them into strengths. An interesting idea to think about. In this position, I have doubled pawns on the king side. It's hard for me to make a passed pawn, of course, with just having that 4 against 3, because it's hard to conceive of what to do. I have to trade off one of the pawns. I began with the move f4. Now, of course, if I make this trade, f for g, say I play f takes g3, h takes g3, then everything has changed. Instead of having doubled pawns, I have the potential passed pawn on the h-file. g5 and h4 will be very hard for him to stop. So my move f4 puts him into immediate crisis. He has to figure out what to do. If he plays g takes f4, then his pawns are separated. He has more pawn islands. And this is a very important theme in the endgame. It's one of the things that Bruce Pandolfini first taught me. In judging the pawn structures in the endgame, you can think about how many pawn islands each side has. After g takes f4, knight takes f4, he'll have 1, 2, 3 pawn islands, and I'll have 1, 2 pawn islands. This might seem rather insignificant, but it's very important in terms of weaknesses because pawns support themselves. The further apart one's pawns are, the more difficult they are to defend and the less coordination they can have. Also, of course, I would have an active outpost on the f4 square, and my king would have free reign into the king side, e6, f5, g5, h4, h3, for example, to attack this way. With pawns close together, they can form a barrier. For example, the pawns on f3 and g3 make it impossible for my king to get in. The pawns on h2 and f3, on the other hand, allow many holes. Paul didn't take, and he also didn't play g4, the other option. The problem with this move is that I would have a protected passed pawn. Always good. I could play h takes g4, f takes g4, and then the move g5. Now, it may seem at first like my pawns are locked onto the color of his bishop, but this is just temporary, and his weaknesses are much more important. My next few moves will be king e6 and f5. He'll play h3, f takes g4, h takes g4. Now, his pawn on g4 is very hard to defend because he can't do it with his bishop, and if my knight is on e5, he can't really do it with the king either. And I can bring my king to the e4 square and prepare to push. And his king can't maintain the blockade on f3 because once my knight maneuvers to e5, for example, like this, there's no way for him to control e4. The g4 pawn goes, my king comes to e4, his position is terrible. So he can't make that decision. He played b takes a4. What would you do now? Always guard against automatic moves, both in the endgame and in the middle game or opening. When somebody takes a pawn of yours, your inclination is usually just to take it back right away. B takes a4 would be my most natural move, but this would be an artificial decision for a number of reasons. First of all, as I've already mentioned, this would create a weakness on the queen side. His king could then play king d3 to c4 and potentially get into the a4 square. I don't want to give him something to target. What my intention was to keep his pawns off balance and keep my pawns intact. My idea was to play knight c3 check, and after his king moves, to play knight takes a4. This blockades his a3 pawn, keeping it on a weak square, gives my knight a very good outpost, gives him more pawn islands than me, opens up holes in his queen side, for example, king e6 to d5, potentially if his king moves, king c4. He has problems now. This is a very solid way to play. But I didn't do it right away. I could play knight c3 takes a4 and then have a tempo on his bishop, but I played an in-between move. F takes g3. Always look for these small differences. Of course, he can't play a move like a takes b5, because then after g takes h2, he can't stop me from queening. He has to take back the pawn. H takes g3. And now I have a potential passed h-pawn. Very important. What did I do? I kept his weaknesses, kept my pawns together. Knight c3 check. King d3, knight takes a4. So you notice that now I've made some good exchanges. This is a very important part of endgame technique. Make the correct exchanges. I played the move f4, traded a pair of pawns on the king side, and created a potential passed pawn on the h-file. We also traded b for a, but his pawn structure got weakened, mine stayed intact. He has holes in the a4 and c4 square for my knight, or maybe for my king, and I control the light squares completely. He played bishop d4. It was under threat. Now I began to push my queenside pawns. c5. Bishop g1. Now I played c4 check. He played king d4, and now I brought my king in, king e6. Now it looks like his king is active, but in fact, he has nothing he can do. He can't get into the c5 square because my knight covers it. I'm preparing now to push on the king side. He played bishop h2. He doesn't really have any other options. He can't do anything active. If he moves his king, for instance, king e4, my knight can jump in. Knight c3, king d4, and now think about this. Knight e2 check would win his bishop. If he goes back to e3, then I just play knight b1. His a3 pawn goes. I win a pawn even on the queen side, and he won't be able to deal with the position down 2 pawns. All he can do is go back and forth. He played bishop h2. He might want to play g4, try to open up the lines for his bishop, but that, of course, will create a passed pawn for me on the king side. There's nothing much he can do. Like other endgames in which I've focused in on keeping his king passive, in this game I'm focusing on keeping his bishop passive. A lot of the time, if you can paralyze one of his pieces, make it ineffective, it's as if you're up a piece in the endgame, or middle game for that matter. I played f5, stifling his plan. g4 is now defended. The bishop has nothing to do, of course, in h2, so he went back, bishop g1. And now I made a very important decision. I'm up a pawn, so of course, one's inclination when they're up material is to be a little materialistic. Just how when somebody starts making money with their life, they become obsessed with accumulating wealth. In this position, I shouldn't be materialistic. I have to try to figure out how to make a queen, how to keep his pieces passive, and how to begin to expand on the king side. One way to do that would be to play g5. That would be pretty logical. I chose a different way. I sacrificed a pawn with f4. His queen side is stifled. My king side would like to start pressing. One weakness of his is on the king side. Another potential weakness of his is on the queen side. He has 2 weaknesses that I'll be working on. f4, again, challenges him. The first time I played f4, I made a good trade, preparing to have a pass pawn on the king side. Now I play f4 again, challenging him. What is he going to do? So if he ignores it with bishop f2, then after the trade f takes g3, bishop takes g3. My passed h-pawn will be very hard to deal with. If he pushes the pawn with g4, then I would play h4, a very important passer. Now his bishop is relegated to passive defense for the rest of the game. Bishop h2, I would play g5, defending it. Now the fact that my pawns are locked in the same color as his bishop is irrelevant in terms of it being a weakness, because he can't get to the base of the pawn chain, the pawn on g5. It's always important, of course, to look at the base of the pawn chain, because that tends to be the weakness. If my pawn were on h6, h6 would be the base of the pawn chain. Now g5 is the base of my pawn chain. But more importantly, the pawns on dark squares actually help me, because they limit his bishop's mobility. There's nothing he can do. His bishop is trapped to defend for the rest of the game. And now all I have to do is maneuver my knight around to the f3 square, or attack his queenside weaknesses. He's paralyzed, and the win is pretty straightforward. After f4, he accepted my pawn sacrifice. G takes f4. I played king f5. So now I have a passed h-pawn. I'm threatening king takes f4, king takes f3, an active king escorting the pawns all the way up the board. He'll be in trouble then. He has to defend the pawn. bishop h2. So now his bishop is stuck defending. It's blockaded by his f4 pawn. I have a passed h pawn. It's even material. I've accomplished a lot so far in this endgame. I've sacrificed a pawn, yes, but now my king is very active. His pawns are weak. What's the next step? What do we do? Obviously, we have to bring the knight into the game. The knight has to maneuver in. But remember, details. Always take care of small things first. If you recall the last game against Jay Bonin, I won because he didn't take advantage of all the little things. He could have thrown in one little pawn check, gained a tempo, and this would have been crucial to the outcome of the game. I want to bring my knight in, yes, but let's make things optimal first. I played h4. There's no reason not to push the pawn all the way up the board before I begin the final assault. I noticed that there was another factor in this position, Zugzwang. His bishop can't move back to g1. His king is keeping my knight off of the c3 square. Something has to give. He has to make a move. If he plays the pawn up to c3, that's another weakness, and his king's going to run out of moves again. He has to move the king. If he goes back to e3, it'll be a passive square. So we play king d5. What now? Now it's time to bring the knight in. Knight c3. King c5. Here's another critical moment. Black to move. What would you do? We were into the 6th hour of play now. Tough stuff. We were both very tired. But my win is near. I'm getting there. In this part of the game, you have to be very, very precise. Don't make a final mistake. We see now that his king side is dooming him. My pawn on h4, pawn on g6, king on f5 put tremendous pressure on his bishop on h2 and his two pawns. All I need is for my knight to get there. On the other hand, his king on c5 is pretty active. If I allow him to take my b5 pawn and his a3 pawn starts to go up the board, this game could come down to a race. Since I'm better, I don't necessarily want that. How can I avoid a race and still bring my knight to the king side? I had to simplify the queen side first. One option would be to play knight e2 and immediately go to the king side. That would be wrong. After king takes b5, I might have problems. Knight d4 check, king c5, say knight takes f3. Now I'm attacking his bishop, but he's starting to go with his pawn, a4, a5, a6. This could get crazy. The most precise way to play in this type of position is to stop all counterplay. I played knight b1. So my idea is to trade off all the queenside pawns with the variation, for instance, king takes b5, knight takes a3, followed by knight takes c2, and once all of this counterplay is gone, only then to play the moves knight e1, takes f3. Take care of the queenside first, then the king side. If he moves his bishop back, bishop g1, then I can play king takes f4. His other option would be to play king b4, defending the pawn. What did I have in mind now? Remember, Zugzwang. Any move that white plays here will be a big problem for him. I play the move c3, holding him back. If I were to play h3, then I would have opened up another possibility for him. He'd have to move bishop g3 back to h2. As it is, his bishop has no moves. After c3, if he plays king takes b5, then I play knight takes a3 check, followed by knight takes c2, and I go to the king side. If he plays a4, I make that trade, and then I go to the king side. His only other option is to play king b3, after which he's far away from queening a pawn, and I would win easily by knight d2 check, king takes c3, knight takes f3. His bishop is trapped, I take it, I make a queen. The win is very easy. After knight b1, he took the pawn, king takes b5, knight takes a3 check, king b4, knight takes c2 check. He has to take the pawn, king takes c4, and now that all the queen side is taken care of, the win is easy. Knight e1, and he resigned. What would follow is a move like king c3, say, knight takes f3. His bishop is trapped, of course, can't go to g1, I take it, otherwise I would even push the pawn h3, h2. It's all over, and the game is winning. So let's think back on this endgame. The first thing I did was lock his pawns with the move h5 onto dark squares. The next thing I did was to play the move f4 and create the potential for an outside passed pawn. Then I brought my king into the game. I kept my pawn base solid, my pawns on c6 and b5, and I gave him more pawn islands than I had by playing knight b2 check and taking on a4 with the knight. Then I sacrificed a pawn, played the move f4, a very important decision. This gave me a passed h-pawn that his bishop had to defend forever, and it gave me a strong outpost for my king on f5. It paralyzed his bishop forever, and then I had to bring my knight into the game. I chose to do that in a way that cut off all of his counterplay. It was very important for me to trade off all the queenside pawns before going to the king side. And finally, once everything was easy, my knight just came to the f3 square and was winning. Control a bishop if you play against it. Don't give it any weaknesses, and make it hindered by its own pawns. A knight can be a very strong piece too. I tell you, one of the harshest realities of competition is that friends sometimes have to do battle with one another. And I felt terrible after beating Paul this game. But afterwards we smiled, we laughed, we looked at the game a little bit, then we went out, had a drink together, and everything was all right. We played basketball the next day. It's a very hard thing having to do battle against a friend, but one of you has to go down and there has to be an understanding that what goes on over the board is business, and afterwards friends are friends.